There's a face JD makes all the time. Someone humiliates him. Dr. Cox tears apart his confidence. A patient reminds him that he has no idea what he's doing. But before the moment has even finished, JD is already somewhere else. The lighting changes, the music swells, and suddenly he's a cooler, smarter, more desirable version of himself. Then somebody snaps him back into the hospital, where none of that happened, and he's still standing there looking ridiculous. That was the rhythm of Scrubs. Fantasy, reality, joke, patient room, another joke, another patient room. We remember the fantasies because they were absurd. We remember Cox's insults because they were vicious. We remember JD and Turk turning a hospital hallway into a playground because they made adulthood look temporarily optional. But Sacred Heart was also a place where people died constantly. Sometimes without warning. Sometimes after everyone had done everything right. Sometimes while the doctors were still carrying the emotional wreckage from the patients before them. The strange thing about Scrubs wasn't that it could move between comedy and death. It was that Scrubs kept placing comedy and death so close together that eventually one became impossible to understand without the other. The jokes were not pauses from the difficult parts. They were the reflex that kept everyone moving when stopping would mean feeling everything all at once. Because at Sacred Heart, the next patient never waited for anyone to catch up. Most workplace comedies need the workplace to become a stage. The office, or a bar, or school provide the location, but the characters' personal problems usually become the real event. Work can't wait while the episode deals with a misunderstanding, or a relationship, or whatever disaster the ensemble created that week. Sacred Heart doesn't wait. A ridiculous argument can be happening in the hallway while someone is dying 10 feet away. A doctor can lose a patient and still have another chart placed in his hand before he's decided how he feels about it. The show rarely gives comedy and grief enough distance to feel like separate experiences. It cuts from one to the other. JD gets humiliated, a patient receives terrible news, Turk makes a joke, Cox attacks somebody's competence, Elliot panics, the shift continues. That rhythm matters because no one at Sacred Heart gets to experience grief in the clean order television usually provides. There's no dramatic timeout. The doctors still have rounds, they still have paperwork. Other people still need them to be calm, decisive, and useful. So nearly everyone develops a performance that allows them to keep functioning. JD turns the day into a story. Cox turns it into a fight he can win. Turk turns it into something shared. Those performances can look like comedy, but each of them is just trying to get through the day in a different way. For JD, that process begins before his first shift even starts. JD begins narrating his life before his first shift has even started. That voiceover is usually treated as part of the show's style, but for JD, it's closer to a survival instinct. He converts confusion into a lesson before he's actually understood it. A terrible day becomes an episode of growth. A humiliating mistake becomes a chapter in the story of the doctor he is eventually going to become. Almost every episode ends with him arranging the day into a takeaway. Sometimes the lesson is real. Sometimes it's just a version of events he needs before he can go to sleep. The fantasies do the same thing more visibly. They let him leave reality without physically going anywhere. When he feels powerless, he imagines power. When he feels unwanted, he imagines admiration. When the hospital becomes too frightening, the world bends for a few seconds into something he can control. Usually, it's harmless. Then the episode My Occurrence shows what happens when the mechanism reaches something JD can't reshape. Ben's cancer has returned, and JD becomes convinced there must have been a mistake. He imagines the correction. He imagines the relief. For a moment, both JD and the audience are allowed to live inside the version where the diagnosis is wrong. The fantasy is comforting because we know the rules. JD can leave reality for a moment, but the show will bring him back. That's the arrangement. He can imagine another world as long as he eventually returns to this one. The danger begins when returning becomes the hardest part. Dr. Cox doesn't fantasize. He would probably consider fantasy a character flaw. His escape is certainty. He turns every room into a hierarchy. Someone is competent, someone is useless, and he's the person capable of identifying the difference. The nicknames help. Calling JD newbie or assigning him another woman's name means Cox never has to speak to him in an emotional language he can't control. Concern becomes ridicule. Investment becomes harassment. Fear becomes anger. That is why his cruelty can also contain care. Cox quizzes the residents he believes might become good doctors. He pushes the people he's not given up on. The insult and the investment arrive in the same sentence because separating them would require him to admit what is underneath both. Cox survives Sacred Heart by acting as if everything can be mastered. If a doctor is prepared enough, smart enough, and relentless enough, perhaps the patient lives. If the patient doesn't live, someone must have made a mistake. That belief makes Cox effective. It also leaves him almost completely defenseless against the deaths that have no satisfying explanation. JD rewrites reality when it hurts. Cox tries to overpower it, and then Ben dies. In a different episode called My Screw Up, it initially feels like an ordinary episode of Scrubs. Ben is back. He irritates Cox. Cox irritates him back. JD gets dragged through the usual emotional obstacle course. The episode keeps moving with the same comic rhythm we trust. Then Dr. Cox arrives at what appears to be his son's birthday party. JD asks him where he thinks they are, and the episode reveals that Ben has been dead for most of the story. The scenes we believed we were watching were not happening in the way Cox experienced them. He had continued talking to Ben because accepting the alternative would have required him to enter a reality he couldn't control. What makes the reveal devastating is not simply that Cox is grieving. It's that the episode uses the normal rhythm of Scrubs to hide that grief from us. We accept Ben's presence because impossible interruptions are part of the show. JD disappears into fantasies constantly. Conversations become bits, and reality bends and snaps back. The comedy has trained us not to question every break from the ordinary, but this time that trust becomes the trap. We're allowed to remain inside Cox's denial because the episode still sounds like Scrubs. The jokes land, the banter continues, nothing announces that we've crossed into grief. Until Cox reaches the place where his performance can no longer protect him. And suddenly the comedy does not feel like relief. It feels like the final language available to someone who cannot yet say what has happened. Dr. Cox eventually encounters something even certainty cannot organize. In the episode My Lunch, a patient dies and her organs are donated to 3 transplant recipients. After the procedures, the doctors discover she had rabies. The recipients died too. Cox had made a medically reasonable decision. That is what destroys him. A simple mistake would have given him something to attack, someone to blame, a lesson to learn, a failure he could prevent next time. But there's no clean correction here. He did what a good doctor is supposed to do, and the results were still catastrophic. Cox can survive guilt because guilt still allows the fantasy of control. Randomness gives him nothing. By the episode My Fallen Idol, the machinery has shut down. The insults disappear, the certainty disappears. The constant performance of being the strongest person in the hospital disappears. He drinks, he stays home, he stops making the sounds everyone has learned to expect from him. JD avoids visiting because Cox's collapse threatens more than his image of a mentor. If Cox's armor can fail, then it was never armor. It was another coping mechanism. Different from JD's fantasies, but built for the same reason. Both men created versions of themselves capable of walking into rooms filled with suffering. JD became the narrator who could find meaning. Cox became the authority who could prevent disaster. And the hospital eventually proves that neither story will always be true. But then, the episode offers another possibility. JD and Turk are preparing for steak night, one of their sacred traditions, when they discover that a terminally ill patient named George has nobody coming to sit with him. At first, they still try to leave. The steak is waiting, the ritual matters. George is a stranger, and staying means accepting what the night is about to become. But they turn around, they sit beside him, and they don't become solemn versions of themselves just because death is in the room. They joke, They talk nonsense. They drink beer. They let George join the rhythm that normally belongs only to them. This could look like another escape, but it's not. JD is not imagining a different outcome. Turk is not claiming they can control what happens. Nobody's pretending George will recover. The jokes do not remove death from the room. They make the room bearable enough that nobody has to leave it. That is the difference between avoidance and presence. Sometimes humor creates distance because reality is too painful to accept. Sometimes humor closes the distance because facing reality alone would be worse. JD and Turk cannot save George. What they can do is refuse to let his final hours become only a medical event. So they sit with him, and they joke. And they keep joking because it lets George spend his final hours with two people instead of two doctors. This is also where Scrubs made a bargain with its audience. The show would take death seriously. It would let patients die. It would let doctors fail. It would acknowledge that doing everything right doesn't guarantee the ending television has trained us to expect, but it would usually provide an exit route, a fantasy, a nickname, a joke in the hallway, a voiceover capable of converting the pain into one final lesson before the credits. That is part of why we loved it. Scrubs gave us emotional truth without demanding that we remain emotionally stranded for very long. We could approach the frightening part because the comedy promised to bring us back. And then the show's greatest episode quietly violated that promise. My screw-up used the familiar rhythm to keep us inside denial. My fallen idol showed us what remained after the rhythm stopped. My last words let the jokes continue, but removed the escape entirely. George still died, JD and Turk simply stayed. We were not just watching doctors learn how to live beside death. We were learning how much distance we needed before we were willing to look at it. On the first watch, JD's fantasies can look childish. Cox's insults can look cruel. Turk and JD's rituals can look like two grown men refusing to grow up. On a rewatch, they look less like random character quirks. They look like systems people built so they could return to work tomorrow. That becomes easier to recognize after enough of life has accumulated. Most people eventually meet someone who jokes through a crisis because sincerity would make the crisis real. Someone who becomes controlling when they're afraid. Someone who narrates a painful experience until it sounds resolved, even though it's not. Maybe we've been that person. The maturity of Scrubs was not that its characters eventually stopped using these defenses. Most of them never did. The growth came from learning when the defense was helping them enter the moment and when it was helping them disappear from it. So go back to JD's face. His eyes drift away, the hospital transforms. For a few seconds, he becomes the hero of a life that exists only in his head. Then reality returns. That returns is the normal part. Across Scrubs, fantasy, sarcasm, and ritual all create enough distance for people to survive Sacred Heart. But the show never treats distance as the destination. JD has to come back from the fantasy. Cox has to admit when certainty can't save him. JD and Turk have to decide whether the joke is helping them leave the room or giving them the courage to stay. That is why the comedy and the grief never truly belonged to separate halves of the show. The comedy was how these characters approached something they couldn't face all at once. And in the best moments, it didn't hide death from them. It got them close enough to remain beside it. That's what Scrubs understood before most shows. Sometimes the joke is how we avoid what hurts. Sometimes it's how we stay close enough to face it. And growing up means learning the difference. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to Millennial Rewind, where we look at the shows we grew up with and figure out what they were really teaching us. Until next time, thank you for watching,